CEO challenged the single dad in front of her team. Fix it, and I'll kiss you right here. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old. And I want to tell you about the morning a CEO pointed at a broken system in front of her entire engineering team, looked directly at me, and said something that made 15 people go completely silent and made me wish I had worn a better shirt. Let me tell you who I was before that morning. I was a freelance IT contractor who moved between companies fixing problems that permanent staff had either caused or given up on. Not glamorous, not a career path anyone plans at 22. But I was good at it, and it paid consistently, and it let me structure my hours around my 7-year-old daughter, Maya, who needed her father present and reliable above everything else. Maya's mother and I had separated when she was 2. Nothing dramatic, just two people who discovered too late that they wanted different lives. We co-parented without hostility, which I considered one of my genuine achievements. Maya was curious and funny, and had recently decided she wanted to be a marine biologist. A phase 1 was fully supporting by watching every ocean documentary available to streaming. I had taken this particular contract through an agency. 3 weeks at Mercer Technologies, a mid-sized software company going through a painful system migration. Their internal team had been working on it for 2 months, and had hit a wall. I was brought in as outside eyes, the human equivalent of turning it off and on again, except considerably more expansive. My first morning I was shown to a workstation, given access credentials, and told the lead engineer would brief me. The lead engineer turned out to be 3 people who all briefed me simultaneously and contradicted each other throughout, which told me a great deal about why the migration had stalled. I spent the first 2 days reading code, logs, documentation, the digital archaeology of how the problem had built itself. I said very little, asked specific questions when I needed to. The internal team watched me with the mixture of hope and skepticism that people bring when an outsider arrives to fix something they've been stuck on. On the 3rd morning, I was called into a conference room. The CEO was already there. Her name was Natalie Reeves, late 30s, the kind of composed that comes from making hard decisions long enough that composure becomes structural. She had dark hair pulled back and the direct attention of someone who does not attend meetings to fill time. Her team arranged themselves around the conference table with the practiced efficiency of people who knew how she ran a room. She looked at me and said she had heard I had been quiet for 2 days, and she wanted to know if quiet meant thinking, or quiet meant lost. I told her thinking. She asked what I had found. I told her. The migration had been built on a flawed foundational assumption about how their legacy data was structured. Every fix the internal team had attempted was correct in isolation and wrong in context. They had been solving symptoms while the underlying architecture worked against them. The room was quiet. One of the senior engineers started to say something about why that assumption had been made. Natalie held up one hand, not unkindly, and asked me what fixing it actually required. I told her. A rollback to a specific checkpoint, a restructure of the data mapping layer, and approximately 2 days of careful sequential work that couldn't be rushed without creating new problems. She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, in front of her entire assembled team, fix it by Friday and I'll kiss you right here in front of everyone. The room erupted. Laughter, surprised faces, one engineer covering his mouth, another suddenly finding his laptop very interesting. Someone muttered that they had never heard that particular performance metric before. I looked at her. She was smiling, not the calculated kind. The genuine kind that arrives when someone surprises themselves by saying exactly what they were thinking. I told her I would do my best, but that I preferred my success metrics in writing. The room laughed. Again, and something in the dynamic shifted. The particular shift that happens when a room decides collectively that they like someone. She said, fair enough. Fix it by Friday and I'll buy the whole team lunch. I said that was considerably more professional, she said. Considerably less interesting though. And then she closed her laptop, and the meeting moved on, as if she hadn't just made 15 engineers laugh for the first time in what I suspected had been a stressful 2 months. I got to work. I want to be honest about what the next 2 days actually looked like, because it was not cinematic. It was long and careful and involved a significant amount of staring at screens and talking to myself quietly and drinking bad coffee from the machine near the server room. The internal team rotated through to help, and I directed them specifically, and they were good once they understood what we were actually solving rather than what they had assumed we were solving. Thursday evening, I found the last fault in the mapping layer. It was small and buried and had been causing cascading errors that looked like something else entirely. I sat back in my chair and stared at it for a moment, the way you stare at something you have been looking for long enough that finding it feels slightly unreal. I fixed it, ran the tests, ran them again, documented everything so the internal team would understand not just what I had done but why, so it would never be a mystery to them. Friday morning, the system ran clean. Natalie was in early. She came to the server room doorway and looked at me, and looked at the screens showing clean migration logs, and said, "You actually did it." I told her I said I would. She said most people who said they would didn't by Friday. I told her I had a 7-year-old daughter who had taught me that deadlines were non-negotiable. She smiled. Then she said with the same directness she brought to everything that she was going to ask me something and that I could say no without it affecting the contract or the payment. I said all right. She asked if I would have lunch with her. Not the team lunch. She would still do that. Separately, just the two of them. She said she wanted to understand how I had seen the problem so quickly when her team had been staring at it for 2 months, and she suspected the answer was more interesting than pure technical skill. I told her yes. Lunch was an hour and a half. She asked good questions, the kind that tell you the person asking has already thought carefully about what they want to understand. I told her about the way I had learned to read systems, the years of moving between companies and seeing the same patterns wearing different clothes. She told me about building Mercer from a 12-person startup to its current size, and what that process had taught her about where companies break down. We talked about our children. She had a son, 9 years old, being raised largely by her, and an ex-husband who was present but lived 3 hours away. She said the logistics were manageable and the loneliness of it was something she had simply learned to work around. I told her I understood that specific geometry. She said, "I thought you might." Derek from the agency mentioned you had a daughter. He said you were the best contractor he had placed in 3 years, and that the reason was that you worked like someone who had something real to go home to. I told her Derek was occasionally right about things. She laughed. The contract ended the following week. On my last day, she shook my hand in the corridor and said the team had asked if I could be brought back for the next phase and that she hoped I would say yes. I said I would look at my schedule. She said, "I'll have my assistant call yours." I told her my assistant was a 7-year-old who screened calls based on whether she liked the sound of the person's name. She said, "What's your daughter's name?" I told her Maya. She said, "Tell Maya that Natalie says the ocean is 95% unexplored and there is a lot of work still to do for marine biologists." I looked at her, she shrugged and said, "Derek is thorough." I went home that evening and told Maya that a CEO had sent her a message about the ocean. Maya sat up very straight at the dinner table and asked what the CEO's name was and whether she had a business card. I told her yes and that I might be able to get one. Maya said, "Good. I'm going to need contacts." 8 years old, already building a network. I went back for the second phase. Natalie and I had a second lunch, and then a third that had less to do with systems architecture. We moved slowly and honestly, the way people move when they have both learned that rushing past the real parts is how you lose them. Some things are worth taking the time to fix properly. If you have ever walked into a room where everyone had given up and quietly refused to, this one was for you. Subscribe. There are more stories here. And every one of them is about people who showed up fully and found out the room had more in it than anyone expected.